So let's take a look at how we could now create the surface for our button. I go into top view and zoom in a little bit. You can see that I have a sketch created here in Illustrator, and that gives me roughly the slope, the width, for example, of the button, the height or the depth, how far, for example, the outer part should step out. And maybe I can turn on the grid and try to make use of the grid for putting down my curves. And here as well, I'm going to use the key point curves instead of doing this by hand. I have created another layer. I'm going to hide those surface layers, and then let's zoom in a little bit. So it says the distance is roughly 10 millimeters long, and I have one line here. And if I zoom in, you can see it actually nearly lines up with the grid. So I can put down my first line, for example, here, and my next line here, or line point. Okay, so that would be, for example, the outer edge. I'm going to delete my guides. Now I would like to create a nice arc, and so that this arc should be tangent to here. So to do this, I create a line starting from the center point to the other side, because now I can use the arc with a tangent and then select this last point, and then, for example, with my Alt key and click and drag to this grid part, where I also stopped my second point for my line. And you see this way those 2 points overlap the same space, and I have a nice arc that goes tangent to the surface. At that point, then I can delete this line because it's not really necessary for me to have anymore. But now this part I actually would like to round, because that button otherwise would have a very sharp edge. And because this is already a very small button, you see it has a depth of 1 millimeter. I have to be careful with my fillet. So I go to Curve Edit, Fillet, and maybe type in a radius of 1, click Go. And then I can zoom in and say, this is my first curve, this is my second curve, click Accept. And then there it created that fillet for me so that this side comes up and then nicely blends over into this arc. So that's then the way how we created the profile actually, which then we could use with the Revolve tool. So now it's time to apply the Revolve tool. Let's double click it, and we can maybe go into perspective view because we're using the x-axis, and then click on this line, click on this line, and you noticed even though we have chain select turned on, alias does not allow you to continue revolve and add those lines to it. So what could be the possible reason for that? Well, the reason is we have the axis set to local. So if we delete this surface and then go back to Revolve, turn on global and select this line, you see now that alias selected the complete chain and created the surface for this button. So that's pretty good. Let's turn on the front view and maybe the side surface. Well, that one we don't really need. Let's zoom out a little bit. And as you can see, we have to move the button down. So we could go to Select Component and then select the first arc and this line. I do not again select the fillet. I do not want to move it by hand because that's going to break the construction history. And when I move the line and the arc, the fillet, which is a feature, will follow this anyway. If I now then go to transform and move, and in perspective view press my right mouse button and move it down, I can maybe try to hit some at the center here, release my mouse button, and wow, the Revolve tool stayed where it was, and I moved my curves only down. So what's going on here? Well, again, the problem is we used global, and we used the global axis. So here is up here the axis. That one doesn't move. So what could we do now to still move those curves and have the Revolve tool or the Revolve surface follow it? And for that we can use so-called vectors. So what are vectors? Let's go back and undo everything. I'm actually going just to reload my scene and go into perspective view. You can find vectors inside constructions, and the vector is nothing else, as the name says, vector, a tool that defines a specific direction. So I can click, for example, the vector tool, and then with my Alt or Option key clicked, I snap on the grid and just click, and this way I have a vector positioned along the x-axis, and it is also on the same layer or height as, for example, my profile. That is very important, that this vector, of course, is exactly at the center of our revolve axis. So what can I do with it? We can go back to surfaces, double click Revolve Tool, and then instead of the x-axis I click picked, and then a picked vector here will open, and see it's empty because I didn't select any vector yet. So I can click this vector, and you see then it puts in the name. Currently the name of this object also is vector. For example, if we go to here, you see that the name is vector. Let's say we'd call this one a vector revolve and close it. Select it, you see, vector revolve. And if we now, with the chain select turned on, click on this line here, that arc, the Revolve tool is now using this vector as the revolve axis and is creating the surface following the curves I created. And the nice part about this approach is, now I could, for example, go into component select, have my construction options, a vector, and the curve tool turned on. I can click my vector. You see the vector makes the revolve tool or the revolve surface magenta, which means it affects the direction. Then I could click my arc and my line. Again, I'm not clicking my fillet. Then I go into a side view, turn on my front, and then I can go into transform, move, and press my right mouse button and then move everything along the z-axis slightly down, and voila. You see, everything follows it. Let's turn on the shaded view so I have a better ability to kind of like take a look at my proportion, and yeah, that looks actually quite good. So you can just fine-tune it. And for example, we could also use this in case we would like the button to intersect with my surface or the front surface a little bit more. We can go into the top view. And for example, here now I'm pressing the middle mouse button, and then move my profiles a little bit inwards in case I would like to. I could, for example, make it intersect. And just position it slightly in front of it. Okay, so this is a very easy tool if you need a specific movable axis for Revolve Tool so that you can move your profiles easily and make the Revolve surface follow it.